Hello, fellow traveler! Today, I want to talk about the interesting thing going on with Dendro and characters who can act as drivers. Now, if you don't know what a driver is, it's the on-field character who isn't necessarily dealing the most personal damage, but enabling the off-field damage dealers with elemental application. As an example, if we look at Raiden's Shogun, you can build Raiden as a hyper carry, where we're really trying to get her damage to be as much as possible, and you'll put her with Bennett, Kujo Sara, Kazuha. Now, if we're going to use Raiden Shogun as a driver, we'll put her with Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett, because ultimately we're trying to get the most out of Xiangling, because her burst, is absolute madness. Raiden contributes by creating reactions and spamming normal attacks, which help with Xingqiu's burst. So you'll see in this scenario, she may not be dealing quite as much personal damage, though she's still doing quite a bit because she's a strong character, but she's helping enable these other characters to do their thing. So when we're looking at drivers, the goal is, of course, to apply an element to usually do something like spam auto attacks. There are some characters who can drive a team without auto attacking, but usually that's kind of what you're doing. And the goal is if they contribute something else that makes them a powerful driver. Kokomi is a great example as a driver. So a lot of people use Kokomi in Nilou teams. Now, Nilou teams are a little bit tricky with the driver because it can be so quick swap that you're not spending much time on one driver, but Kokomi is going to be better than, say, Mona. Both of them are Hydro Catalyst characters. They both can normal attack and apply Hydro, which is great. But Kokomi has a skill that lasts so much longer and is so much better at applying Hydro that she's applying that Hydro and her normal attacks. And on top of that, of course, she's healing, which you done need if you're going to be using Nilou on the team at all. Because people joke about Klee being the one that's killing everyone with bombs. Nilou is the most destructive character we have. So that's kind of an example of why you would pick a specific driver. But I want to talk about Dendro Drivers because they're kind of interesting to me and I don't really know what Hoyoverse's goal is with all of them, but let's talk. So before we get into Dendro, I think it's kind of important to look at the other elements. Some elements really lend to the idea of a driver over others. For example, Hydro's a great element to look at. So we've got characters like Mona, Barbara, Kokomi. We've got Child, Ayato, and technically even Candace. All of these characters can drive, can apply Hydro while they're on field and act as this driver character. But when we look at Pyro, for example, we don't really have great Pyro driving characters. We've got someone like Yanfei, who does normal attack and apply Pyro. We've got someone like Klee, who does normal attack and apply Pyro. But there aren't very many teams that utilize this driving mechanic from them. Typically, you're trying to boost their own damage. You're trying to vaporize Yanfei's charge attacks, for example. Electro characters, we've got a few options. I already mentioned Raiden. Sino, I think, can kind of count as a hybrid driver. He's an interesting one, him and Alhaitham, actually, because both of them, they do drive a team. So with Alhaitham, he's got a great option to do Hyper Bloom. So he's sort of driving the Hyper Blooms. He's applying that Dendro so that we can get the cores and use Kuki or Raiden to hit those cores. But he also contributes a lot of personal damage. So that's kind of the trade-off of using him as a driver, is you get more personal damage. Sino is in a similar position. Then you've got characters, of course, like Lisa and Yaimiko, but I don't see them too often showing up driving teams, but it's possible. Animal characters, Sucrose is great, Heizo is great. Technically, you could probably try to drive a team with Wanderer. Cryo drivers are particularly tough. I think we've long hoped we would get a cryo driver, partially because so many of the good Pyro teams are very vaporized based. It would be great if we could have a really strong melt team, and there aren't too many, at least that I see, that are consistently used. So right now our cryo drivers, we don't really have one. I mean, we don't have a cryo catalyst at all, unless I'm completely forgetting someone. But Chongyun, you can get normal attacks, cryo, but it doesn't apply enough cryo to really do much. Ayaka converts her normal attacks briefly, but just then, it's not going to work that well in any of the teams I know of. And then we can look at Geo Drivers, of course, dead in a ditch. So as you can see, Hydro is one of the biggest elements, and I would say Animo is probably pretty strong as driver type characters, and throw in Electro. But Dendro looks to also be very, very strongly lending towards this idea of driver characters. So we've got Nahida, Alhaitham, pretty soon Kaveh, technically Baizhu, and they just announced Kirara. And, if you want to count it, because she has to be on field during her burst, you could even say that Yao Yao, in a sense, can act as a driver. Now, she's one that is probably not going to be doing the, normal attack spam that's going to drive a team, but she does have to run around on field to apply that Dendro. I won't focus too much on her, but let's talk about the other ones. One of the biggest problems, and one of the reasons why I want to talk about this at all, is because of Nahida. The thing is, Nahida is so strong that in many cases it's just hard to justify another driver. And if you do bring another driver, you're probably pairing that driver with Nahida. But we see Nahida all the time on Nilou teams acting at least as a partial temporary driver. Since it is quick swap, she might not be on the field too long, but she can apply Dendro with normal attacks. Her skill applies Dendro and reapplies Dendro and is fantastic. She's got decent strength on her own, so she's just overall great. She doesn't have incredible range, but decent range, so she's just so strong. And she's already built high EM, which also lends to certain teams. So for Nilou, she's going to be perfect to do some of the driving, because if she owns some of those blooms, her high elemental mastery is going to mean that they hit harder. Now, someone like Alhaitham doesn't have as high EM, but you're still building EM. So, if he owns some blooms, that could work. You could run him on a Nilou team. I don't see it that commonly. Most people are going to go Hyperbloom or Aggravate spread teams for Alhaitham. The goal here generally is to kind of boost his damage, but he can still drive some of the bloom reactions going on like Hyperbloom if you want to run that way. I have tried Alhaitham on a Burgeon team. It's actually kind of fun. But it's not the most optimal team in the world. I did beat, what was it? One of the pretty tough Abyss levels I pulled off because of his Burgeon team, and I don't know why it worked so well. I think it had the Abyss Lectors and it took down their shields in like 0.2 seconds flat. It was amazing. So that's kind of when you would use Alhaitham as a driver. Baizhu we have coming out. Most people aren't going to be using Baizhu as a driver. My guess is he's not really meant to be a driver, but he can if you're close range. He doesn't have great AoE as far as we can tell, but he could act as a driver. He does apply Dendro with his skill and his normal attacks. And what's interesting is he does have a few perks in his own kit that do boost his own damage. He can boost his own elemental damage. I think his custom weapon can help increase his own damage in that way. So if someone really wanted to build him as a driver, you definitely could. And I think he could probably do a pretty okay job. Getting up and close and personal with a bad guy might just work out. So this is where we're getting, for me, what feels a little bit tricky. So we've got some good characters that already act as drivers, and now we have Kaveh and Kirara. Kirara, to me, is more justifiable in terms of the teams that she seems to be good with. It seems like they really want Kirara, based on what I've seen, and all this can change, of course, but it seems like they want to focus her towards the spread, aggravate, quicken type teams. And I think partially the reason I'm seeing this is because she has a really high scaling burst. So my guess is that you want to actually get the boost from her burst and not put her on like a Nilou team where you're not going to get any additional damage because Quicken hasn't been applied to an enemy. Her shield also seems to lend to this playstyle. I'm not convinced that her shield is going to be able to tank a whole ton of bountiful cores. So the shield would probably break and then it doesn't, recreate itself like Baiju's or anything like that. But if you're, of course, running around a Quicken team, you don't get the damage from the cores as often. More useful, at least in defending yourself from enemies than from the blooms. She'll probably work on Hyper Bloom teams, but I do think you sacrifice a little bit to use her on such a team. If you do use her with Nilou, it's probably just for fun. In my head, you put Barbara with her, you ram people to apply Dendro and Hydro and explosions galore. That still sounds fun to me. Kaveh is the one that I just really can't figure out. His kit clearly seems to be geared towards regular bloom damage. Not so much putting him with Nilou and getting Nilou's bountiful core bloom damage, but just blooms by themselves. But the problem I see with blooms is, as far as I'm aware, if he uses his skill and blows up, say, 6 bloom cores at once, the internal cooldown, I don't know how that's going to work. And I'm not really sure how those mechanics are going to make sense. Now, it sounds like if you get him to C6, at that point, blooms will be exploding much quicker. So he does kind of get a boost once he's that far along. So maybe he's kind of geared towards like a fridge team, I think might be kind of fun, especially if you're able to group enemies together, freeze those enemies, and then go ham with Kaveh's burst and just explode as many of those blooms, create as many of those blooms as possible. That might be a fun and interesting way to try Kaveh, but I don't see Kaveh being super useful on some of the other teams. So it's just interesting to me that we have so many potential characters that we can use as Dendro Drivers. And they all sort of have a bit of a niche, whether it's, additional power, additional personal damage in the case of someone like Al-Haytham, whether it's just the pure convenience of having everything in your kit except for healing like Nahida, whether it's having the shield and healing that Baizhu has, and if you get his Constellation, you can use his skill multiple times. Maybe you go wild and put sacrificial fragments on him and use the skill even more. The sky's the limit. Kaveh here for bloom damage, Kirara here probably for quicken teams. So it seems like they have sort of put each of these characters into their own niche, and I'm curious to see how most people will use them and if they'll find most of these niches useful. I don't know how useful Kaveh's niche is going to be yet, or if he's just going to be a character he's useful if you like him, but he's not going to outperform a Nilou team by any means. Kirara, I think, is going to be a little bit like Sayu, kind of just fun to use. I don't think Kirara is going to be the most powerful, most potent, bring to the abyss Dendro character, but you get to boot, scoot, and boogie along the ground, and that is going to be delightful, so I'm excited. So let me know what your thoughts are on all these different driver characters, what you're kind of thinking of doing with them. I'm so curious. I feel like you can be so creative with these characters. Tell me who you're excited for, who you're building, who you're gonna roll for. Yeah, and that's it. So I will see you next time, Traveler.